The story begins in a dungeon, a labyrinth where reckless adventurers dream of getting rich quickly. Among these dungeons are some so difficult that nobody should ever set foot inside them. Deep within one such labyrinth, a group of adventurers made their way forward. A woman watching them through a crystal ball asked her master what she should do, and he decided they should be thrown out. The man sat upon a throne surrounded by many different kinds of monsters. This was the story of Rick Ellard, an exiled alchemist who would become the world's most powerful dungeon master. In the royal capital of Alraj, people gathered inside a tavern to discuss the latest news. Hero Alan's party had conquered the impossible Ouroboros dungeon, further cementing their status as living legends. No matter how dire the situation became, they could always turn it around in no time. Alan possessed a miraculous power granted only to the brave, earning him the reputation of the perfect hero. Even so, an old man remarked that not even they could truly be called perfect. The scene shifted to the room of a young man busy brewing a mixture in a large pot. Smoke rose from the pot, and the young man smiled with satisfaction as he admired the result, believing it would make an excellent potion. His name was Rick Ellard, an alchemist. Alchemists primarily supported adventuring parties by creating items through alchemy, and that was Rick's role. Suddenly, someone called out from outside and announced that he was coming in. The visitor was Hero Alan, an unrivaled sword master who had conquered countless dungeons. He was a true hero who enjoyed tremendous support from people throughout the country. Rick excitedly tried to show Alan the potion he had just completed, but Alan immediately stopped him, saying that he needed to discuss something important. Rick smiled and waited to hear what it was. Alan got straight to the point and informed Rick that, effective immediately, he was being expelled from the party. Rick was left in shock and asked if it was a joke, but Alan made it clear that it was not. Alan explained that the decision had been made by all of the party members. Unable to believe it, Rick asked why in a trembling voice. Alan answered that he had found a better alchemist. At that moment, a woman entered the room, adjusted her glasses, greeted Rick, and introduced herself as Dorma Greygane. She remarked that Rick probably did not remember her, that it was fine, and that they had never been friends anyway. Alan informed Rick that Dorma would be using the room from that day onward and told him to hurry and leave. Rick attempted to protest, but before he could finish, Alan reminded him that he had been kind enough to let Rick use the room in the first place, and that it was only natural for him to leave immediately after being expelled from the party. Rick could not help asking why. After all, he, Victor, and Alan had been together from the very beginning. Looking down at Rick, Alan responded sarcastically that he did not know before suddenly shouting at him. The outburst frightened Rick and brought tears to his eyes as Alan condemned him for his incompetence. Alan declared that Rick had been an eyesore for the longest time, that he could no longer tolerate him, and that Rick was nothing more than a carefree research fool who had been dragging the party down and was no longer suitable to remain with them. Stunned on the floor with the potion he had just brewed beside him, Rick quietly accepted the decision. As his final farewell to the party, Rick made one last request to Dorma, asking her to at least accept the potion he had made, as it added new effects to the golden potion. He handed it to her, and Dorma examined it analytically. She asked what ingredients it contained and acknowledged Rick's skill as a chemist, noting that he had remained in the hero's party until now. However, she laughed and claimed that even she could make such a potion, declaring that Rick was completely inferior to her. Enraged by the remark, Rick slapped the potion he had just handed her out of her hand. Frustrated, he ran for the exit, while the unfazed Dorma merely observed that it had been a waste for him to do that. Alan coldly stated that he had no use for incompetence and ordered Dorma to prepare for the next dungeon. Wearing a smug smile with her eyes closed, Dorma acknowledged the order while remarking that she pitied Rick, assuming he had been an old member of the party. Alan cast a menacing glance at her and declared that Rick had never been worthy of accompanying a hero, and that there was nothing more to it. He then questioned whether Dorma would avoid disappointing him the way Rick had. Dorma responded with an arrogant smile, confidently assuring him that she would. Still unable to believe what had happened, Rick walked away carrying his belongings on his back, absent-mindedly tearing leaves apart with his hands. An image of Alan surfaced in his mind, and Rick bitterly reflected on how many times his potions had saved him. Having just been cast out of the party, he concluded that he would have to sell a few potions to earn some money as he continued rustling through the bushes. As Rick wandered after being expelled from his party, he spotted a young injured woman lying along the path. The sight surprised him. The woman slowly opened her eyes, barely able to see, and pleaded for help if anyone was nearby. Rick immediately asked if she was all right and what had happened. As he examined her, he noticed that she had wings and wondered if she could be a spirit. Gasping for air and struggling to breathe, she introduced herself as Yuri, a dungeon spirit, and begged Rick to help her. Rick assisted the weakened woman to her feet, though he remained confused about whether she truly was a dungeon spirit. It was explained that dungeon spirits were being sustained by the life energy of the monsters and adventurers within their dungeons. Rick had heard of their existence before but could not believe they looked like Yuri. His thoughts were interrupted when Yuri, coughing heavily, warned that she would die if things continued this way. Startled, Rick wondered how that could happen. Still struggling to breathe, Yuri desperately pleaded with Rick, a human, to form a contract with her as she grasped his hand. Behind them, the silhouette of a muscular leg emerged. It belonged to a werewolf. A twig snapped as the beast approached with its jaws open, leaving Rick stunned because a wolf should not have been there. The ferocious creature growled as it advanced, its fangs large and razor-sharp. The werewolf suddenly charged at them. Rick frantically considered what he should do, realizing it would be difficult to fight a monster like this by himself. As Yuri continued struggling for breath, Rick closed his eyes and made his decision. Although he admitted that he did not understand what was happening, he agreed to form a contract with her if it would save her, hoping she would then run away before the werewolf reached them. The moment Rick gave his consent, Yuri instantly recovered. Her beautiful wings spread wide as she radiated brilliant light. She clasped her hands together with her eyes closed as though in prayer before opening them again, her eyes sparkling with joy as the contract was completed. Rick turned back to her in complete confusion while the werewolf rapidly closed the distance, growling as it prepared to launch another attack. A black orb suddenly engulfed both Rick and the werewolf. Rick felt himself falling and stretched out his arm as he screamed at the top of his lungs. Just before hitting the ground, he unexpectedly began floating, only to fall a moment later. He stood up in confusion and looked overhead. He found himself inside an enormous building. As he took in the structure and noticed a monster engraved upon it, he realized where he was. Before he could finish the thought, Yuri happily informed him that the dungeon had been completed. Rick first checked whether Yuri was alright. Having fully recovered, Yuri cheerfully thanked him for forming a contract with her and began referring to him as her master. Relieved to see her doing well, Rick watched as Yuri even considered calling him her darling. Before the moment could continue, the furious werewolf let out another deafening roar and prepared to attack again. The sudden threat startled Rick, while Yuri remained expressionless. Looking behind him in surprise, Rick realized that the werewolf had followed them. Completely unfazed, Yuri handed Rick a glowing item and instructed her master to take it. She explained that it was a dungeon catalog and excitedly encouraged Rick to create a monster with her. As the dungeon master, Rick would be able to control the dungeon however he wished. Breaking into a sweat, Rick reluctantly proceeded and summoned 5 winged monster eggs with eyes at the cost of 500 DP. Moments later, the eggs cracked open and hatched. As the werewolf roared at them, goblins emerged from the eggs and immediately rushed toward the beast, attacking it with punches and kicks. While watching the battle unfold, Yuri explained that she had spent 9 years searching for a master. Dungeon spirits would die if they failed to form a contract within 10 years of their birth. She admitted that she was a failure but expressed how happy she was that Master Rick had accepted her. Rick quietly reflected that Yuri was just like him. He honestly admitted that he did not know how much he could do for her, but promised to do his best to build a great dungeon. Smiling, he made his resolve clear. Grateful, Yuri embraced him. Holding his hands, she vowed to remain by Rick's side, obey whatever he asked of her, and stay with him for the rest of his life. Rick was overwhelmed and flattered, leaving him momentarily speechless, while Yuri enthusiastically declared that they would not lose to any adventurer and would do their best together. Confused, Rick questioned the mention of adventurers. Yuri explained that once a contract was formed, a person became a dungeon master and was required to defend the dungeon against attacking adventurers and monsters. She told Rick that their first priority was preparing the dungeon for future attack. Although Rick became visibly worried and agitated, Yuri reassured him that there was nothing to fear and that she would teach him how to get started. Rick then realized that becoming a dungeon master meant he was now an enemy of humanity and would eventually have to face Alan and the rest of his former party. As Yuri lay on the bed, she silently resolved that she would do anything if it was Master's order. She wished only to remain by his side forever. Rick stared at her in disbelief. The thought that Yuri would truly do anything left him swallowing nervously before hesitantly responding. Yuri was breathing heavily through her mouth, panting and covered in sweat. It was revealed that she had been assisting Rick in the alchemy laboratory alongside the goblins while observing his work. Rick requested a copper distiller, a scalpel, and a boiling pot. Overwhelmed by the growing list of supplies, Yuri pleaded for him to give her a moment. Curious, she then asked what he intended to do with all the tools and medicines he was preparing. Later, gathered around a board game, Yuri explained the fundamentals of dungeons to Rick and the goblins through 3 main concepts. First, a dungeon master was someone who managed a dungeon after forming a contract with a dungeon spirit. Second, dungeon spirits were beings that had to find a host within 10 years of their birth in order to survive, sustaining themselves on the energy of visiting adventurers while maintaining the labyrinth. Finally, dungeons were dangerous, monster-filled structures ranked from G to SSS in difficulty. Despite the risks, they constantly attracted adventurers seeking fame and fortune because of the immense treasures hidden within their cores. As Yuri idly floated through the air, she reminded Rick that the dungeon belonged to him. Rick looked back at her and reflected that, due to unexpected circumstances, he had ended up forming a contract with her. Aside from her wings and ears, Yuri looked like an ordinary girl. He even found her cute before immediately dismissing the thought, reminding himself that he could not allow himself to be charmed by her, and that helping someone who had collapsed had simply been the natural thing to do. Noticing his unusual behavior, Yuri asked what was wrong. She suddenly appeared behind him and leaned over his shoulder, startling Rick so badly that he hurriedly denied anything was wrong before losing his balance and falling to the floor. Yuri was surprised by his reaction and quickly checked on him. Rick's face turned bright red as he struggled to compose himself, unable to imagine that they would truly stay together forever. In a trembling voice, he finally acknowledged her. Rick then turned the conversation to dungeon points. Yuri explained that dungeon points represented the total amount of energy possessed by the dungeon. Gesturing toward the board game and a miniature goblin figurine, she continued by explaining that the points were used to create monsters and traps to defend the dungeon, and that everything available for creation was listed in the catalog. Rick flipped through the catalog in amazement and was stunned to discover that it also contained common goods and adventurer equipment. The possibility of even building his own atelier filled him with excitement, making him wonder if he was dreaming. Yuri immediately shattered that thought by making it clear that such a thing was not allowed. She continued explaining that a dungeon was essentially a living entity that absorbed life energy and converted it into dungeon points. It created treasures to attract adventurers, while dungeon spirits sought areas with high concentrations of life energy. At the same time, wild monsters constantly invaded the dungeon. With a better understanding of the system, Rick realized that the werewolf they had encountered must have been one of those invading monsters. Yuri nodded before reminding him that, before spending dungeon points on his own interests, he first needed to create monsters and traps to repel intruders. Rick could only reluctantly agree. Yuri firmly emphasized that dungeon management always began with defense, and that it was the highest priority of every dungeon master. Rick let out a heavy sigh. Although the dungeon seemed like the ideal environment for an alchemist, it came with far too many responsibilities. Turning her attention to the goblins, Yuri explained that the dungeon currently possessed only the monsters Rick had created earlier. The G-rank goblins could be seen playing with a slime of the same rank. She added that they were all among the weakest monsters available. Rick could only react with surprise at yet another disappointing revelation. Monster ranks ranged from G to SSS, with G being the weakest and most common, while SSS represented the strongest and rarest monsters. Curious, Rick asked whether the monsters obtained were completely random. Yuri explained that the probability of summoning a G-rank monster 5 consecutive times was only about 3% and concluded that everything ultimately depended on luck. Hearing that, Rick dramatically collapsed onto the floor in tears, feeling even more overwhelmed by the explanation. Rick then explained that he wanted to use the remaining dungeon points to expand the dungeon, but doing so felt far too risky. After thinking for a moment, Yuri cheerfully suggested that he could simply fight by himself. Rick looked at her and questioned whether he appeared strong. Considering his slender build and complete lack of combat experience outside of making potions, the answer was obvious. Yuri could only respond with an awkward groan. Trying to encourage him, she assured him that even if he was weak, her feelings toward him would never change. Rick stared into the distance and imagined himself standing alone against a horde of enemies with a weapon in hand. The image felt completely unrealistic. He returned his attention to the dungeon catalog and continued turning its pages. Suddenly, something caught his attention. An idea came to him. Looking at Yuri, Rick confirmed that monsters created with dungeon points would obey all of his orders. Yuri nodded and explained that they were very obedient. Satisfied, Rick smiled before asking Yuri to prepare several items for him. Yuri simply watched him with curiosity, wondering what he was planning. The scene then shifted to a bird's-eye view of the royal capital of Alridge, where rows of rooftops stretched across the city. Seated at a table with his party, Alan frowned in irritation and clicked his tongue in annoyance while a muscular man beside him attempted to ease the tense atmosphere. Victor Goldsmith, the party's tank, attempted to comfort Alan by reminding him that everyone made mistakes from time to time. However, Alan remained irritated. He turned to the party's mage, Matilda Olsen, who cautiously acknowledged him, fully aware of his mood. Alan questioned why she had used thunder magic against the elder Arachne despite its weakness to fire. Unable to justify her actions, Matilda lowered her head and admitted that she had panicked before apologizing. Alan then shifted his attention to Fitz Rosson. Nervously responding, Fitz was immediately questioned about why he had defeated a different enemy instead of the one Alan had ordered him to attack. Scratching his cheek awkwardly as sweat ran down his face, Fitz explained that he had believed the other target was the better choice and wondered if his decision had truly been that bad. His answer only further fueled Alan's frustration. Alan finally turned to Dorma. Startled, she stiffened before quietly responding. Alan harshly criticized her performance since joining the party, condemning her support timing, item management, pursuit decisions, and every other aspect of her work. He sarcastically implied that her performance was beyond belief. Looking down in shame, Dorma admitted that she had nothing to say. Alan suddenly slammed both hands onto the table and rose to his feet, the loud impact silencing everyone nearby. Furious, he declared that he was tired of such incompetence and questioned whether the perfection he had believed the party possessed had merely been an illusion. Unable to meet his gaze, Dorma turned her face away and repeatedly apologized. Victor finally stepped in and told Alan that it was enough. He reminded him that Dorma had only recently joined the hero's party because she admired him. Dorma remained silent with her eyes fixed on the floor. Alan looked down at her briefly before turning away. He instructed everyone to get some rest before leaving the table and walking away from the party. Fitz remarked that Alan had been truly furious. Leaning back in his chair, he added that they really had performed terribly and that they had become too relaxed after the trash had left, referring to Rick. He then looked toward Mary Plato, the party's healer, expecting her agreement. Before Mary could respond, Fitz suggested that they eat something instead. Mary simply agreed while keeping her gaze lowered to the table. Fitz then tried to encourage Dorma, telling her not to be depressed and offering her some of the food. The scene shifted to Alan striking a wall with his fist. Consumed by anger, he insisted that his strategy had not failed because it was reckless. He declared that they had only challenged an A-ranked dungeon and that, as the hero, he should have been clearing SSS-ranked dungeons instead. In frustration, he kicked an object aside and angrily questioned why the others had held him back. The outburst left him panting as he vented his emotions. After gradually calming down, he looked at his own hands and convinced himself that it had merely been bad luck. He reflected that if a certain thing had activated, he could have cleared that level on his own, and lamented that he only needed that one thing. The scene then shifted to an image of potions known as monster synthesis. Rick explained that monster synthesis was an alchemy technique. Although his specialty was pharmacology and the technique was outside his field, he intended to study it. As Yuri watched him prepare the potions, she questioned whether he was certain about attempting it. Rick confidently affirmed his decision and explained that he wanted to consult a book on the subject while holding what appeared to be a potion. Impressed by his ability, Yuri wondered if he could truly remember everything he read. Rick casually explained that such a talent was simply part of being an alchemist. Yuri silently doubted that ordinary alchemists were capable of such a feat. Rick then calculated that everything he planned to do would cost only 300 dungeon points. If the process succeeded, they should be able to upgrade a G-rank monster into a D-rank monster, so he decided to try it immediately. The cauldron was prepared as the process for basic monster synthesis began. The procedure consisted of mixing the necessary chemicals, extracting the magic stone from a goblin, adding the goblin's corpse, and stirring the mixture. Holding the required ingredients, Rick explained that once everything was added, the synthesis would be complete. As Yuri observed the process, she quietly thought that alchemy was surprisingly harsh. Once all the ingredients had been combined and thoroughly mixed inside the cauldron, the contents suddenly emitted a brilliant light. Rick and Yuri watched in astonishment as a massive creature emerged with a thunderous rumble. It was a Cyclops, an A-rank monster. Rick was amazed by its enormous size and wondered whether it would obey his commands. He cautiously ordered the Cyclops to sit. Despite its immense stature, the Cyclops obediently sat down and silently stared at Rick and Yuri. Standing before the towering monster, Rick concluded that there did not seem to be any problems. Even so, he reflected that the Cyclops was an A-rank monster whose normal summoning rate was less than 2%, making it an exceptionally formidable creature. Yuri explained that the Cyclops was 6 ranks above the goblin and that such a monster should never normally appear in their dungeon. Confused by what had happened, she wondered what it meant before deciding that it must be fate. Her thoughts were suddenly interrupted when she sensed someone approaching. An intruder had entered the dungeon. Startled by her announcement, Rick turned his attention toward the crystal ball. The intruder appeared to be an adventurer and seemed to have entered alone. Judging by the man's equipment, Rick estimated that he was either B rank or C rank. Resting a hand on her chin, Yuri cheerfully remarked that even a group of 10 adventurers would stand no chance against the Cyclops as they continued watching the intruder's progress through the crystal ball, which displayed the dungeon's other floors. Yuri excitedly urged Rick to give the Cyclops its orders. Rick attempted to do so but suddenly hesitated in confusion. He found himself questioning exactly what he was about to do and wondered whether he was truly intending to kill another person. Noticing his reaction, Yuri looked at him curiously. Rick quietly dismissed it as nothing. Rick then ordered the Cyclops to intercept the intruder. The adventurer was shocked by the sight of the enraged Cyclops and could not understand why such a monster existed inside a G-rank dungeon. The Cyclops struck him with a single punch, sending his sword flying from his hand. The tremendous force hurled the adventurer into a wall, leaving a pool of blood beneath him as he coughed up blood from the impact. The adventurer then collapsed to the ground, dead. Overjoyed, Yuri embraced Rick, celebrating their success and the dungeon points they had earned. Although Rick forced a smile, sweat formed on his face because he was responsible for killing the adventurer. The dungeon point earnings and spending table showed that 2,500 DP had been earned. The breakdown listed a dungeon creation bonus of 10,000 DP and buried adventurers worth 1,500 DP. The dungeon points consumed totaled 800 DP, consisting of 500 DP for monster eggs and 300 DP for monster synthesis materials. The current dungeon point balance and total earned stood at 1,000 DP. Seeing Rick's expression, Yuri became concerned, but Rick insisted that nothing was wrong. Inwardly, however, he reflected that although he had felt slightly uneasy at that moment, he had experienced no real remorse despite being responsible for killing someone. The belongings of the deceased adventurer, including his scarf and sword, were shown. The dungeon still required another 7,500 DP to reach the next rank, while reaching SSS rank would require 999,997,500 DP. Several low-ranking monsters appeared, including a G-rank slime, an F-rank hobgoblin, a G-rank kobold, and a G-rank goblin. Rick immediately realized that his luck was as bad as ever. Yuri assured him that it was fine because he could simply rely on monster synthesis. Rick let out a sigh and told himself not to think that way. As steam rose from his cauldron, he admitted that he had never expected to miraculously create another Cyclops like the day before. Suddenly, a tremendous crash shattered the silence. Rick instinctively pulled Yuri toward him to shield her from danger. Immediately after the impact, a massive and terrifying monster with enormous fangs let out a menacing groan before roaring ferociously. Rick stared at the creature in complete shock, wondering if it was a behemoth. Yuri confirmed that there was no doubt about it. As the behemoth drew closer, Yuri reminded Rick that this was the result of his special skill. Rick repeated the words to himself in disbelief. A memory surfaced of Rick happily walking behind the party with a huge backpack filled with equipment, while Victor walked ahead with a faint smile and Alan remained focused as he led the way. Staring at the behemoth, Rick questioned whether it had truly been created through his monster synthesis. Yuri confirmed that it had. She explained that, just like the Cyclops before it, the behemoth had been synthesized from G-rank monsters. Under normal circumstances, such a combination could only produce a monster up to 3 ranks higher. Looking at Rick, Yuri concluded that he possessed the ability to create monsters that exceeded that limit. Rick looked down at his own hands in disbelief, admitting that he had never known he possessed such an ability. Yuri reassured him that everyone had a field in which their talents truly shined and suggested that becoming a dungeon master might be his destiny. A smile gradually spread across Rick's face as he repeated the word, destiny, to himself. Feeling inspired, he resolved to begin the next monster synthesis immediately, and Yuri readily agreed. Yuri soon noticed Rick staring into the distance and wondered what was wrong. Rick insisted that it was nothing, explaining only to himself that he had been thinking about the difficult experiences of his past. As he reflected, a memory resurfaced of a terrifying behemoth roaring ferociously. In that memory, Alan and Victor confronted the monster together. Alan blocked the behemoth's attack while urgently checking whether Rick had finished preparing the potion. Panicked, Rick hurriedly combined the ingredients and indicated that he was almost done. Moments later, he completed the mixture and threw the flask toward Alan. Alan caught it without hesitation and prepared himself. As the behemoth roared once more, Alan drank the potion. Power surged through Alan as his eyes flashed with newfound strength. He burst forward at incredible speed and unleashed a devastating slash that cut straight through the gigantic monster. The behemoth crashed to the ground with a series of heavy thuds while Alan remained standing calmly. The rest of the party watched with relieved smiles before gathering around Alan, praising his strength and suggesting that they celebrate. Rick remained standing apart from them. Rick ran down the hallway, panting heavily as he hurried toward the meeting room. After arriving, he apologized for being late. Victor noticed his tardiness and informed him that the next dungeon had already been decided. Rick bowed before placing a tray of potion bottles on the table with enough force to surprise everyone. Smiling, he admitted that he had become absorbed in his experiments after the previous mission. Since they had obtained many materials from the behemoth, he had tried to develop the best potion effects for each party member and intended to continue experimenting with the various ingredients. Victor smiled and welcomed him over. Rick handed Victor a potion, explaining that he had modified his stamina potion by shortening its recovery time while increasing its defensive effects, believing Victor would know exactly when to use it during battle. Victor accepted it with a chuckle, thinking of Rick as a complete potion enthusiast. Rick then turned to hand a potion to Alan, but before he could finish, Alan slammed the bottle onto the table and dismissed it as useless. Rick froze in place. Alan leaned forward, glaring at him angrily as he harshly questioned whether Rick even understood his role within the party. Alan declared that Rick was only part of the party because he could produce golden potions despite otherwise being useless. Victor tried to calm Alan, reminding him that Rick was doing his best, but Alan questioned when Rick's personal interests had ever been useful. He insisted that the party was already strong enough not to rely on potions, and that they already had both a healer and a mage to provide support. Alan then instructed Rick to make sure they never ran out of golden potions as they had before. Looking down with a forced smile, Rick quietly accepted the criticism. Rick reflected that, in the beginning, he had been the only one capable of filling the party's lack of support, but over time there had become fewer and fewer tasks that only he could perform. He began questioning whether there had ever been any point in joining their missions at all. Yuri silently listened as Rick considered different ways he could have contributed, such as remaining at the base to build up their inventory. Even so, Rick knew that many situations required immediate action. He remembered that an alchemist's greatest strength lay in understanding the situation and producing items flexibly according to the circumstances. He also realized that many items useful for dungeon management existed, including communication papers that could be claimed through blood and used for remote conversations, as well as warp platforms that allowed travel between dungeon floors and even different dungeons. Noticing that no adventurers were entering the dungeon, Rick let out a long yawn and wondered if it would be alright for him to get some sleep. He then looked toward Yuri and considered whether she was tired as well. Yuri smiled and explained that dungeon spirits did not need to sleep. She offered to keep watch over the dungeon while Rick rested. Grateful, Rick thanked her before wondering if he could spend dungeon points to create a pillow. Yuri was puzzled by the request. Rick explained that he could comfortably sleep on the hard floor as long as he had a pillow because he wanted to save his dungeon points until he could afford to make a proper bed. Smiling, Yuri instead offered her lap as a pillow. The unexpected suggestion completely startled Rick, leaving him staring at her in shock. Embarrassed, he insisted that there was no need and that he would feel guilty. Yuri persisted, assuring him that he was free to use her however he wished. She encouraged him not to be embarrassed about relying on any part of her body and urged him to come closer, leaving Rick flustered. In the end, Rick rested his head on Yuri's lap, sweating nervously as she looked down at him with a gentle smile. She asked how it felt, and Rick could only respond with a series of awkward, hesitant sounds while blushing and avoiding her gaze. He eventually admitted that it was comfortable, though he added that they should make a proper bed the next time. Yuri smiled with her eyes closed and gently encouraged Rick to sleep peacefully. A short while later, Rick quietly called her name. Yuri looked down and realized that he was still awake. Rick brought up the events of the previous day, reflecting on the battle with the adventurer. He admitted that, despite being responsible for someone's death, he had not felt any guilt. He continued wondering why that was, believing that, even if he had not struck the killing blow himself, it would have been natural for him to feel something as a human. Yuri explained that it was most likely because of the contract they had formed. She told him that, to a dungeon spirit, people losing their lives within a dungeon was simply part of the natural life cycle. By making a contract with her, Rick had also become one with both her and the dungeon. Rick realized that this was probably why Yuri had shown no emotion when the adventurer died and questioned whether he was no longer human. Yuri smiled and gently embraced him. She reassured Rick that even if that were true, he was still her master and that only Rick could be the dungeon master of this dungeon. Rick accepted her words. His thoughts briefly returned to Alan questioning whether he understood his role. Resting his head on Yuri's lap, Rick quietly realized that this was where he truly belonged. Meanwhile, elsewhere, a girl tightly gripped her hat as she cried out for Rick's help. Another party arrived at the mysterious dungeon that no one had been able to clear. A woman in the group confirmed that they had reached the mysterious G-rank dungeon. The party was led by Randall Moritz, a group of intermediate adventurers with an average rank of B. The woman with her hair tied in a bun questioned why they were challenging a G-rank dungeon in the first place. Another party member, wearing a hood and glasses, explained that the main reason was the lack of information. Although a month had passed since the dungeon had been discovered, no one knew how to clear it. Adjusting his glasses, he pointed out that the dungeon's internal layout and monster distribution should already have been mapped, yet almost nothing was known about it. A bearded adventurer clad in armor added that even experienced mappers had failed to return. Mappers were adventurers who earned their living by exploring newly formed dungeons and producing maps filled with useful information for future explorers. Smiling confidently, Randall concluded that it was probably a simple trap that had claimed overconfident adventurers. He speculated that the previous parties had become careless after encountering only goblins and other low-ranking monsters, and had realized the true danger only after it was too late to retreat. Looking at his companions, he questioned whether they would make the same mistake. The woman with the bun confidently struck her fist into her palm, convinced that they would never allow that to happen. She believed that even in the worst situation, they would still be able to withdraw safely. The rest of the party shared her confidence. Filled with determination, the group entered the dungeon. They intended to prove to everyone who had grown arrogant from temporary success what a true victory looked like. Reality proved far harsher than they had expected. Shortly after beginning their exploration, Randall was killed. The surviving party members stared in disbelief as his lifeless body hung by one leg in the grasp of a cyclops. The adventurer wearing the hood and glasses watched in horror, unable to comprehend why such a high-ranking monster could exist inside a G-rank dungeon. As death drew near, his thoughts turned to his mother. He remembered her constant concern for him and the promise he had made to become a famous adventurer. He had wanted to make her proud and provide her with a better life after the loss of his father. Moments later, another party member met the same fate when the Cyclops slammed him into the ground with a single punch. In his final moments, he thought about the future that would never come. He had planned to earn enough money from his next job to marry his partner and imagine the joy and support they would receive from everyone back home when their child was born. The Cyclops seized another adventurer, throwing the remaining party members into complete panic. They desperately attempted to retreat after noticing other high-ranking monsters nearby. Moments later, a behemoth appeared. The enormous creature advanced with a menacing growl. The adventurer standing before it recalled his plan to retire after this expedition. He had dreamed of purchasing land in the countryside and spending the rest of his life in peace. That dream ended instantly as the behemoth bit into his head, killing him on the spot. Only the woman with her hair in a bun remained. As the behemoth prepared to finish her off, Rick intervened. Watching through the dungeon's crystal ball, he ordered the monster to stop pursuing her and allow her to escape. Yuri immediately questioned whether that decision was wise. The scene shifted to the terrified woman fleeing for her life while Rick continued observing through the crystal ball. He explained that they had been making a small mistake. Confused, Yuri wondered what he meant. Rick pointed out that they had eliminated every adventurer who had entered the dungeon so far. Although that strategy provided excellent defense and generated dungeon points efficiently, it also created a long-term problem. If every adventurer died, rumors would eventually spread that the dungeon was a death trap. As a result, fewer adventurers would be willing to challenge it, causing the dungeon's popularity to decline. Yuri quickly understood his reasoning. If some adventurers survived, they would spread stories about the dungeon and encourage more people to attempt it. Rick agreed. High-ranking adventurers already visited the dungeon from time to time, so it was not entirely unknown. However, his greatest concern was increasing their dungeon point income. Without a steady supply of dungeon points, they would be unable to expand or improve the dungeon. As Rick explained his strategy, Yuri listened attentively, clearly impressed. She admired his reasoning and concluded that becoming a dungeon master suited him perfectly. Yuri then revealed some good news. Because the adventurers had been successfully driven away, another section of the dungeon had been unlocked. More importantly, the dungeon itself had advanced from G rank to F rank. Surprised, Rick wondered how the ranking system worked. Yuri explained that dungeon growth involved special milestones in addition to accumulating dungeon points. To advance from G rank to F rank, Rick needed to collect 10,000 dungeon points, a requirement he had already fulfilled. As a result, the dungeon had ranked up, and the dungeon catalog had been updated. Handing the catalog to Rick, Yuri explained that many new items and options had become available. Rick was delighted by the news. With access to better materials, he realized he would be able to create even more advanced alchemy tools. Yuri responded by giving Rick a meaningful look. Rick immediately understood what she meant. Dungeon management always began with defense. As he flipped through the updated catalog, he pointed out that the adventurers they had allowed to escape would inevitably reveal information about the dungeon's strength. As a result, stronger adventurers would eventually come to challenge it. To prepare for that, they needed to strengthen the dungeon as quickly as possible. Rick spent 1,000 dungeon points to summon 10 monster eggs and another 2,500 dungeon points on 5 monster synthesis materials. After the eggs hatched, he eagerly began another round of monster synthesis. Meanwhile, far away, Alan's party was attempting to conquer the lower levels of an SS-rank dungeon. Alan was visibly exhausted after battling countless monsters. Fitz noticed his condition and remarked that the party leader seemed unusually unsettled. Victor responded that everyone became tired from time to time. Fitz acknowledged that but pointed out something more important. Alan's unique skill greatly increased his abilities according to the level of danger he faced. If the skill failed to activate, it suggested that the situation was not truly life-threatening. Under normal circumstances, that should have been reassuring. Even so, Fitz believed the situation was different for the rest of the party, who were nowhere near as powerful as Alan. Alan, meanwhile, remained frustrated because his skill had once again failed to activate. His repeated failures had begun to attract attention among other adventurers. Some questioned when the hero's party had last been forced to retreat from a mission, while others wondered whether the dungeon was truly as dangerous as rumored. Overhearing the conversation, Alan angrily ordered them to stop talking. Victor could do nothing but remain silently at his side. After the party returned home unsuccessful in clearing the dungeon, Mary and Victor sat together over coffee. During their conversation, Mary quietly wondered whether inviting Rick back into the party might be the right decision. She admitted that Alan no longer seemed like himself and questioned whether the party's problems had begun after Rick left. Victor acknowledged that Dorma was performing well. Although her movements in combat were somewhat awkward, he believed the quality of her potions was arguably superior to Rick. Even so, he admitted that the difference between the two alchemists alone did not seem sufficient to explain Alan's recent behavior. Mary agreed that Dorma was talented, but she questioned whether ability alone was the real issue. Ever since Rick had left, the atmosphere within the party had changed. Everyone seemed more tense, Alan constantly appeared to be on edge, and Mary felt as though she could barely breathe whenever he was around. Victor admitted that he understood exactly what she meant. Before he could say anything further, Mary reflected on Rick. She acknowledged that he had been clumsy and overly obsessed with potions, often failing to notice what was happening around him. Even so, he had always worked hard and remained cheerful regardless of how difficult the situation became. More importantly, Rick had saved the party time and time again. Victor silently agreed. In fact, Victor suspected that Rick's popularity and reliability were the very reasons Alan had expelled him. Setting his coffee cup down, Victor wondered whether Alan could ever bring himself to apologize to someone he had personally cast out of the party. Mary had no answer. If Alan's skill problems were tied to his state of mind, confronting him about Rick would likely only make the situation worse. Victor eventually concluded that the discussion had not been entirely meaningless. The truth was that no one fully understood how skills were activated. With so many unknown factors, he decided that the best course of action was to continue observing the situation for the time being. Mary reluctantly accepted that conclusion. Elsewhere, Dorma sat alone inside her atelier with the lights turned off. After closing the book she had been reading, she walked over to her brewing table and began wondering whether everyone was focusing on the wrong problem. Holding a potion in her hand, she questioned whether something truly important was missing. The scene then shifted back to Rick and his dungeon. Examining his latest creations, Rick was pleased with the result. He had successfully synthesized an A-rank arachne, a second A-rank cyclops, and an A-rank king slime. Yuri believed their dungeon had already become powerful enough, but Rick disagreed. He reasoned that if news spread about a behemoth residing in the dungeon, it would not be surprising if a party with strength equivalent to S-rank adventurers eventually appeared. He also pointed out that the monsters guarding the deeper sections of the dungeon were still relatively weak. A D-rank Cerberus and a D-rank smallworm would not be enough to stop elite adventurers. Rick further realized that there seemed to be a daily limit to the number of powerful monsters he could create through monster synthesis. Yuri suggested using their remaining dungeon points to expand the dungeon instead, and Rick agreed. However, as he looked over his monsters, another idea came to mind. Up to that point, he had only combined low-ranking monsters through monster synthesis. He began wondering what would happen if he fused two A-rank monsters together. Yuri immediately supported the idea, believing the experiment was well worth attempting as soon as the monster synthesis limit reset. Rick eagerly agreed, excited to discover what kind of monster such a fusion would produce. Together, they watched the dungeon's crystal ball, hoping to complete the experiment before another intruder arrived. Suddenly, the crystal ball began to vibrate, signaling that someone had entered the dungeon. Yuri dismissed the intruder's confidence for entering alone. Rick, however, quickly recognized the figure displayed within the crystal ball. To his surprise, the intruder was Mary, his former party member. Mary looked down from a balcony and noticed a commotion below. Among the crowd, she recognized Cheyenne, the woman who had previously entered the dungeon, sitting on a bench in tears. Mary hurried outside to meet her and immediately asked what had happened and where the others were. Cheyenne lowered her head, visibly shaken. Devastated by what she had witnessed, she revealed that they were all dead. Confused, Mary struggled to comprehend her words. As Cheyenne recalled the names of Randall, Evan, Utak, and Barrick, she broke down in tears, unable to finish as she spoke of everyone who had died. Still in disbelief, Mary sought confirmation that they were truly gone. A passerby explained that a new dungeon had been discovered in the woods outside Outridge. Although a month had passed since its discovery, no one knew what lay inside, so Randall's party had gone to investigate. The expedition had ended in disaster, with Cheyenne as the only survivor. News of the party's deaths quickly spread among the adventurers. Randall's party had been known for its careful strategy, making their destruction inside a G-rank dungeon difficult for anyone to understand. One adventurer attempted to comfort Cheyenne by pointing out that at least she had survived. Cheyenne, however, hysterically insisted that it had not happened that way. She believed she should have died as well, but the monsters had intentionally spared her. She explained that not only had the monsters possessed unusually high ranks, but they had also moved as though they were being controlled, anticipating the party's every action. Trembling with fear as she recounted the experience, Cheyenne became convinced that someone inside the dungeon had deliberately allowed her to escape alive. Another man dismissed her claim, insisting that dungeons were nothing more than labyrinths inhabited by monsters and questioning the idea that someone had intentionally spared her. The conversation stirred a memory within Mary, causing her to think of Rick. Apologizing to Cheyenne for bringing up such a painful subject, Mary acknowledged how difficult it must be before asking her to share more details about the dungeon. The scene then shifted to Mary traveling to the mysterious G-rank dungeon. Watching through the dungeon's crystal ball, Rick was puzzled by her appearance. Curious, Yuri asked whether he knew the woman. Rick explained that Mary had been the healer in his former party, but he remained confused about why she had come alone. Mary called out for Rick, asking whether he was somewhere inside the dungeon and pleading for him to reveal himself. A cyclops suddenly appeared before Mary. As Rick and Yuri observed the scene through the crystal ball, Yuri wondered what Rick intended to do. After thinking it over, Rick decided that he wanted to speak with Mary. The cyclops gently seized Mary in its hand and carried her through the dungeon. Upon reaching Rick's room, it opened its hand and released her. Mary looked around in confusion, uncertain why the cyclops had brought her there. Rick then greeted her. Rick remarked that it had been a while as he looked at Mary. Surprised that her suspicion had been correct, Mary realized that it truly was Rick. Rick asked whether she had known all along. Mary explained that she had studied dungeon structures during her time at the academy. After noticing Yuri, she identified her as a dungeon spirit. She reasoned that the dungeon had been discovered around the same time Rick left the party, and that only Rick would have thought of allowing a single survivor to escape instead of killing every intruder. Because of that, she had begun to suspect that the dungeon belonged to him. Before she could continue, Rick expressed his relief that Cheyenne had returned safely. Mary immediately became angry and confronted him, demanding to know whether he understood what he was doing. Rick was taken aback by her reaction. The scene shifted to a memory of Victor introducing Mary to Rick as the party's new healer. Mary introduced herself as Mary Plato, promised to do her best to meet everyone's expectations, nervously bowed to the party, and asked for their support. Rick smiled warmly and assured her that there was no need to be so formal. He expressed how much having another member would help the party, explaining that until then, he, Victor, and Alan had been covering for one another. Alan remarked that, now that they had gained a talented healer, Rick's potions would probably no longer be necessary. Rick gently disagreed, believing that a party could never be too well prepared. He introduced himself as Rick Ellard and offered Mary a handshake, which she nervously accepted. The memory continued inside a B-rank dungeon. While exploring its depths, Rick concluded that the next floor was probably the boss room. Victor suggested taking a break before the monsters noticed them and advised Alan to rest because he had been pushing himself too hard. Sweating from the previous battles, Alan sharply rejected the advice. He ordered Mary to heal him, and she immediately complied. Alan then criticized Rick for standing around and instructed him to make a golden potion instead. Rick quietly accepted the task. Rick sat behind the group preparing potions while Mary healed Alan. Watching the treatment, Victor complimented Mary for making it much easier for the party to maintain a steady pace. Mary thanked him. Alan remarked that, on the other hand, Rick had become nothing more than a research fool waiting for instructions now that he had one less responsibility. Victor gently reminded him that the party still relied on Rick's potions for attribute countermeasures and status enhancements. Alan reluctantly admitted that they were better than nothing while Mary continued healing his arm. Afterward, Mary approached Rick while he worked on his potions and asked if he had a moment. Rick smiled and encouraged her to simply call him Rick. Concerned, Mary asked whether he was alright because Alan and Victor had been rather harsh toward him. Rick assured her that everything was fine and that it was nothing unusual. Mary admitted that she was worried her role as the party's healer might actually be making things harder for him and confessed that she did not know what she should do. Rick chuckled softly and reassured her that she did not need to worry. He explained that if she kept worrying about him, she would not be able to perform at her best, which would only cause problems for herself. Relieved, Mary thanked him and thought of him as kind. Rick then explained that all he wanted was to continue his research in an environment where he felt comfortable. He appreciated the opportunity to make new discoveries alongside a party that constantly challenged unknown monsters and unexplored dungeons. He also pointed out that the harder Mary worked, the less work he would have to do, allowing him to devote even more time to his research. Smiling once again, Rick reflected that he genuinely liked how things were going. He then stood up, walked over to Alan, and informed him that the golden potion was ready while Mary quietly watched him. Mary quietly reflected that she had wanted to help Rick, yet in the end, he had been the one helping her instead. She realized that this was what true kindness meant. Returning to the present, she thought about the Rick she knew, but her thoughts were interrupted when Rick called her name. With his arms open and Yuri floating behind him, Rick assured Mary that he had not changed at all. Mary remained silent. Rick continued by explaining that he was still devoted to his research and that creating powerful monsters was merely a byproduct of it. Mary interrupted him, unable to understand how he could turn against humanity. She suspected that the dungeon spirit was exploiting Rick's resentment toward Alan and controlling him. Yuri immediately denied the accusation, explaining that she had done nothing so malicious. Rick calmly explained that he was no longer angry with Alan for expelling him from the party. He believed Alan had made the decision because he needed to make room for himself and insisted that Alan was not a bad person. It had been Alan's choice, and if anything, that decision had ultimately helped Rick. Because of it, he had found a place where he could finally make full use of his talent. Even if doing so meant clashing with someone else's ideals, he had resolved to fight with everything he had, even if his opponent was Alan. Growing more resolute, Rick reaffirmed that this was the life he truly wanted. Even so, Mary still wished for him to return. Rick understood that her feelings came from herself rather than from Alan or anyone else. Nevertheless, he admitted that he was not kind enough to abandon his place in the dungeon for her and apologized. After the conversation ended, Rick slumped into his chair and let out a long sigh of relief. Yuri scolded him, believing it was rude to make a girl cry. Resting his head against one hand, Rick reflected that, after killing so many adventurers, worrying about something like that now was far too late. He had become the dungeon master, and no matter what happened, he would protect that place. Unable to do anything else, Mary looked back at the dungeon one last time before leaving in tears. Chapter 6 began with a fast-forward to a chibi-fied version of Yuri, who appeared upset. As she flew around the room, Rick wondered whether he had done something wrong. Yuri insisted that nothing was wrong and told him not to worry, but she asked what kind of relationship he had with Mary. She claimed that she did not care what kind of relationship they had, while Rick admitted that he did not even know what kind of relationship she meant, explaining that Mary had only been a party member. Pouting, Yuri assumed they must have been good friends since Mary had gone through the trouble of chasing him all the way into the dungeon. Rick questioned whether that was really the case, recalling that Mary had always been kind and believing she treated everyone that way. Rick confirmed that his skill would activate at the end of the day, with a B-rank Treant standing behind him. He explained that preparing to create A-rank monsters required extensive work, so he would appreciate Yuri's help. Yuri looked away without answering before remarking that it had been a long time since they had signed their contract together. Thinking back, she realized she still knew nothing about her master. She wondered what kind of adventures Rick had experienced before meeting her and what kind of people he had known. She reflected that, in their rush to sign the contract, they had neglected to spend time together and get to know one another. Rick reasoned that they had not had any choice under those circumstances. Yuri continued staring at him, arguing that even so, she had heard it was common for couples in new relationships to become excited after only a few months of dating, marry quickly, grow disillusioned by each other's shortcomings, and eventually drift apart. As Yuri continued rambling, Rick wondered where a dungeon spirit had heard such things. Rick admitted that he knew nothing about married couples, prompting Yuri to gasp. He explained that he believed they shared a codependent relationship and that they were in it together, reminding her that she had said so herself. He thought they should get to know each other better from then on and believed they had plenty of time to do so. Delighted by her master's words, Yuri hugged him, realizing that she had been wrong and that she had simply been jealous. Rick was relieved that she understood. Watching Yuri embrace Rick, the monsters remarked that she had always been like that. Rick then changed the subject and decided to try synthesizing an A-rank monster. In the capital of Alraj, Alan and Victor sparred with their swords. Alan remained frustrated as he thought about why his skill had failed to activate. While exchanging blows with Victor, he wondered whether he was missing a condition or whether the problem lay within the skill itself. Their swords clashed as Alan became increasingly lost in thought, finding the situation absurd. His frustration grew into fury, and he tried to preserve his pride by reminding himself that he was Alan Cole, the hero. He had been recognized by the king, overcome countless ordeals, remained undefeated, and received constant praise. He believed himself to be a man who did not fear death. That realization turned his thoughts toward his party members, whom he considered so frightened of death that they could barely meet his gaze. Convinced that every member of his party was incompetent, his agitation and rage continued to build, and he vented those emotions during the sparring match. Victor was disarmed, and his sword landed on the grass before he calmly urged Alan to stop. Alan instead raised his sword above his head. Feeling the overwhelming intensity radiating from him, Victor silently wondered whether Alan intended to kill him. Victor scolded Alan, insisting that he needed to calm down. Alan snapped back, insisting that he would never get back on track if he remained on edge all day and telling Victor to be quiet. Their exchange ended abruptly when a woman called out to them. Victor asked what had happened, and a party member informed them that Mary had disappeared. She explained that Mary had never stayed away from her room for an entire day without informing anyone, leaving her with no idea where she could have gone. Alan coldly dismissed the matter, deciding that they should forget about Mary because there were plenty of healers just as capable as she was. The woman objected to such a remark, but Alan simply walked away, refusing to be bothered with matters like that. A drunken Fitz joined the conversation while drinking more wine, remarking that there were no substitutes and smirking as he wondered who would willingly board a sinking ship, referring to their party. Alan stared at Fitz coldly as he continued drinking and questioned whether he wanted something. The drunken Fitz explained that, with the way Alan was acting now, it was doubtful they would ever conquer SSS rank dungeons, let alone unite another party in the future, though he admitted it was only his opinion. Irritated by the remark, Alan warned Fitz not to mock him and seriously questioned whether he had followed him simply because he wanted unity and friendship. Alan was about to declare that even a fighter like Fitz could be replaced, but Fitz finished the thought himself, acknowledging that there would always be someone to take his place and that there was no doubt about it. He then scoffed and added that the same applied to Alan, the brave hero. Alan's irritation became even more apparent. As Alan bowed before the king seated upon his throne, it was explained that the title of hero was bestowed by the king upon a select group of adventurers considered exceptional. Although they remained adventurers, they also served as symbols of the kingdom. Depending on their achievements, the king could replace a hero whenever he wished. Fitz only deepened Alan's frustration by remarking that Alan was probably the one in the greatest trouble at the moment. Alan's anger reached its peak, but the scene shifted as a girl arrived. It was Mary. She apologized for being absent for a while. The other party members were relieved and expressed how worried they had been, asking where she had gone. Mary apologized again and explained that she had gotten lost on her way home while gathering herbs. Still in a foul mood, Alan remarked that she had saved him the trouble of finding a replacement. He then walked away and ordered everyone to prepare for the next mission. Back in the dungeon, Rick explained that combining A-rank monsters followed the same process as combining lower-ranked ones. The only real difference was that dismantling the monsters used as materials, such as the A-rank Arachne and the A-rank King Slime, was far more troublesome. Disgusted as the Cyclops dismantled the other A-rank monsters, Yuri nevertheless assured him that the Cyclops could handle the work. Rick explained that the process itself remained unchanged, but it would take longer than usual, so they might as well expand the dungeon while waiting for the dismantling to finish. As they expanded the dungeon, Rick held the catalog while Yuri flew beside him. She wondered how her master had ended up joining the heroes' party. Rick recounted an incident from his home village, where a traveling fortune teller had given him a prophecy. The elderly fortune teller had instructed him to leave the village and seek out Alan Cole of Alridge, claiming that doing so would give him the opportunity to leave his name in history. Yuri repeated the words fortune teller in surprise. Rick acknowledged that believing such a wild story sounded foolish, but he had been unable to resist the possibility. Wanting to master alchemy, he had wanted to change his world. He reflected that perhaps everything had begun with that baseless prophecy. Yuri listened in surprise as Rick continued, explaining that Alan had accepted him despite his sudden appearance. Rick recalled that Alan had been proud even back then, though not as arrogant, and looking back, he believed Alan's growth might have stopped after obtaining his skill. The scene then shifted to the middle layer, the 10th floor of an S-rank dungeon, where Alan and his party were present. Victor broke into a heavy sweat as he found the situation strange. There was still no sign of Alan's skill activating, and now the problem extended beyond Alan, as the party was no longer coordinating with one another. Fitz spoke up, convinced that everyone had already realized the situation, and concluded that their only option was to retreat. Despite his exhaustion, Alan continued walking forward. Fitz shouted after him, asking whether he was even listening. Alan told him to keep quiet and declared that if Fitz wanted to leave, he could run back alone. Fitz insisted that he was serious and sarcastically questioned whether Alan truly believed they could face a dungeon master in their current condition. He doubted they would even make it out of the dungeon alive. Turning to the others, he asked whether they agreed with him. Alan bluntly questioned what Fitz was so afraid of. He claimed that Fitz's lack of awareness was what had driven them into such a desperate situation. Fitz dismissed that kind of awareness and continued arguing his point. As the two argued, Victor noticed a reptilian creature sneaking up behind them. He called out a warning to Fitz, but it came too late. The lizard-like creature slashed Fitz's leg clean off, sending it into the abyss. Fitz collapsed to the ground, overwhelmed by the excruciating pain. Back in Rick's dungeon, the cauldron bubbled more violently than before, and no one understood what was happening. As it rumbled, a beam of light suddenly burst from it. None of them had ever witnessed such a reaction. The scene shifted back to Alan's party. Without a trace of remorse, Alan sarcastically remarked that Fitz now had an excuse to leave the party. Meanwhile, an unseen object appeared to be cracking. Alan continued mercilessly, declaring that Fitz was finished as both a party member and a fighter, and that once he escaped the dungeon, he would simply find someone to replace him. To provoke Fitz even further, he added that finding a replacement for his missing leg might be more difficult. The remark succeeded in angering Fitz. Victor called out to Alan, insisting that he had gone too far and that his comment had crossed the line. The mysterious object continued to develop more crack. Alan ignored Victor and claimed that everything was the result of Fitz's weak eyes and weak body. He argued that if Fitz could not even take care of himself, there was no way he could keep up in the future as Alan rested his sword at his waist. As his final insult, Alan declared that he did not want incompetent people like Fitz or Rick in his party. The cauldron finally cracked apart, revealing a humanoid figure emerging from within. Rick was surprised to see that it was a girl. The mysterious girl looked around at her surroundings and wondered where she was. Yuri was shocked that another unknown woman had appeared in what she considered their love nest. At the beginning of Chapter 7, Yuri became flustered as she hurriedly scolded the naked girl for not getting dressed, wondering whether she was not embarrassed to be without clothes. Rick, however, was astonished that no matter how he looked at her, she appeared completely human. Although he was certain she was a monster because she had been born through synthesis, he could not comprehend what kind of being she truly was as she silently stared back at him. Yuri suddenly covered Rick's eyes, pointing out that the mysterious girl was still just a child. Since she had only just been born, Yuri reasoned that it was only natural for her to have no clothes. The girl quietly murmured the word clothes, and garments instantly appeared on her body. Rick's curiosity only deepened as he wondered how she had accomplished such a feat and what kind of monster she could possibly be. Breaking the silence, the girl asked who Rick was. He introduced himself as Rick Elrod, the alchemist who had created her. She curiously asked whether he had truly made her. Amazed by the situation, she examined her own hands before wondering what she was. Rick himself remained at a loss. The girl continued asking questions, wondering where she was, why she was there, what the ground, the dirt, and the darkness were, why the world existed, by what principle it functioned, and where the consciousness asking all of those questions had come from. Unable to understand anything, she became overwhelmed. Rick remained stunned, having never witnessed anything like this before. Yuri explained that dungeon monsters normally possessed no ego because they obeyed the dungeon master absolutely. However, if her master's skill transcended that rule, then perhaps he had created a new life with its own sense of self. Rick admitted that he had only encountered such alchemy in literature. The girl then addressed Rick directly. If he truly was her creator, then he must be her god. She pointed at him and demanded to know the reason for her existence and why she had been brought into being. Before Rick could answer, she turned toward Yuri and demanded to know who Yuri was and why she existed. Yuri proudly introduced herself as Yuri, the dungeon spirit who had built the dungeon together with her master. She explained that she existed solely to devote herself to her master. The girl remained silent. Yuri leaned closer and asked whether that answer had satisfied her. Without warning, the girl pulled down Yuri's garment. Yuri immediately blushed in embarrassment and shock, while Rick also flushed at the unexpected sight. Yuri cried out in embarrassment, wondering why the girl had done such a thing. The girl justified her actions by explaining that she had been annoyed. Still flustered, Yuri anxiously asked her master whether he had seen anything. Embarrassed by the incident, Rick nervously covered his eyes and assured Yuri that he had not seen anything as sweat formed on his face. Yuri immediately called out Rick's lie, noticing that the truth was written all over his face. She recalled that she had planned to show everything to her master on their first night together. Rick became flustered at the mention of their first night. Yuri continued talking about how she would take everything off because she wanted her master to see everything. Blushing, Rick quickly objected, unable to understand what she was talking about. The unnamed girl innocently wondered why they were making so much noise over a single piece of cloth. Rick turned back to the girl and repeated what she had said earlier about not knowing where she was, or even who she was. The girl's attention focused on him. Rick explained that he had once felt the same way. He had only been a humble alchemist and had not known what he was capable of until he arrived there, met Yuri, and created the dungeon. After synthesizing monsters, he had finally realized where he belonged and what he could do. Believing the same would happen to her someday, he reassured the girl that she would eventually discover who she was. Until then, he told her she could think of the dungeon as her home. Rick extended his hand for a handshake while Yuri watched him from the side. He introduced himself once more as the dungeon master who ran the dungeon and expressed that it was a pleasure to meet her. The girl reached out to shake his hand, blushing slightly. As their hands met, she decided that she would address him with proper respect and call him father. Rick was startled by the sudden title. The girl explained that it was only natural because he had created her, and she asked him to treat her as though she were his own daughter. Rick scratched his head before bowing slightly and accepting the role of her father. Yuri quietly thought the conversation had become rather strange. The girl then turned to Yuri and asked if it would be acceptable to call her mother as well, believing it was only fair. Yuri blushed and smiled happily. She agreed that they were like one family, so calling her mother was only natural. She thanked the girl for being such an understanding child. As her mother, she then asked what the girl's name should be. The young girl requested a name that was both appropriate and dignified. Rick thought of one and suggested the name Cruz. The girl quietly considered it. Rick explained that it would be the name given to her by her father. He added that he had taken the name from a homunculus dwarf in a flask mentioned in Golden Age literature. Yuri praised Rick for his thoughtful choice. Rick went on to explain that the goal of alchemy was to uncover the mysteries of life and reach into the realm of the god. Before he could continue, the girl's attention shifted to the crystal ball. She apologized for interrupting his explanation of the name's origin, but she wondered whether it was alright for him to ignore what was being shown inside the crystal ball. Rick and Yuri quickly looked at it and were shocked to see the Cyclops being killed by adventurers. Rick became concerned that someone had managed to defeat an A-rank monster. Although he knew rumors about the dungeon would spread quickly, he felt this was happening far too soon. Yuri warned her master that the intruders were advancing through a newly created section of the dungeon where the debris and traps had not yet been properly arranged. Panicking, the two searched through the catalog and decided to call the behemoth and the other monsters back from the other section, but they struggled to find the communication paper. Cruz asked her parents whether she should kill the humans. Rick and Yuri could only stare at her in silence. Believing the task was simple, Cruz decided she could handle it on her own. Yuri worried that they were sending her out based only on hope because they had no idea whether the girl would actually be alright. The adventurers were confused when they saw a child standing before them. One of the men warned the others not to be fooled by appearances and reminded everyone to stay in formation. Before he could finish, Cruz moved in an instant and slashed his neck with one hand. The man collapsed to the ground as blood poured from the wound. The remaining adventurers were horrified and confused by what had just happened. Cruz smiled menacingly as she licked the blood from her fingers, realizing that humans were much more fragile than she had expected. The scene shifted to the royal palace, where the king sat on his throne with his butler beside him. While taking a bite from an apple, the king remarked that the hero had been slacking off lately. The butler agreed that it was a problem. The king questioned how many times the hero had failed to conquer a dungeon that month. As he impatiently tapped the arm of his throne, he reflected that he had already heard the same excuse 7 times. He acknowledged that the situation was becoming serious. Although he considered providing Alan with more funding, he knew the Senate would soon begin complaining if Alan continued to produce no result. It could also give other countries and rivals an opportunity to take advantage of the kingdom's weakness. The butler pointed out that Alan's achievements up to that point could not simply be ignored. The king agreed as he held his apple. The king decided to give Alan one final chance. He had heard about a dungeon that had recently been growing at an unusually rapid pace near the capital. A party of adventurers had entered it, believing it to be an ordinary new dungeon, only to be completely wiped out. Reports also claimed that monsters far stronger than the dungeon's rank should allow had appeared inside. The king considered the dungeon a suitable test to determine the true quality of the kingdom's hero. Meanwhile, Cruz licked the blood of the adventurers she had just killed before standing and wiping the blood from her face. Despite everything, her stomach continued to rumble with hunger. The king continued wondering whether the hero would prove his worth or whether the dungeon would instead reveal just how dangerous it had become. Rick and Yuri watched the crystal ball in horror as they realized that Cruz was a vampire. She had not been infected but had been born as one. She was what was known as a true ancestor, and her strength was equivalent to an SS-rank monster. Rick thought that having an SS-rank monster like Cruz might finally allow them to compete with the hero. Smiling with her fangs exposed, Cruz reported to her papa that everything was over. Cruz completely dominated the battlefield, defeating a group of armored soldiers entirely on her own. She grabbed one soldier and slammed him headfirst into the ground with a loud impact without even sparing him a glance. As the other soldiers charged toward her, she threw a powerful punch that launched them flying backward through the air. She then struck down the remaining fighters, and they crashed into one another with a tremendous explosion before collapsing in complete defeat. Throughout the battle, her expression remained completely bored. Watching the one-sided fight, Rick was left speechless by her overwhelming strength. All he could do was mutter to himself in amazement. As Rick and Yuri walked through the hallway together, Yuri remarked on how well Cruz had performed. Rick noted that their dungeon points were increasing rapidly. Inside one of the rooms, Cruz happily dove face-first onto a massive mattress, enjoying how soft and fluffy it was. As they continued walking, Rick's expression changed into a confident, knowing smirk. He hinted that there was an even greater advantage than the dungeon points. Opening a nearby door, he revealed a huge laboratory filled with towering bookshelves, advanced alchemy equipment, and a giant metal tank. Looking around the room with satisfaction, he reflected that he now possessed tools he could never have imagined having while he was in Alan's party. Rick then noticed Yuri looking troubled and asked what was bothering her. He immediately became nervous, waving his hands as he hurriedly explained that he had only been spending spare dungeon points on his hobbies. He added that he understood the rank of the intruders had been increasing recently, but with Cruz protecting the dungeon, defeating them should not be difficult. Yuri admitted that this was exactly what worried her. She acknowledged that the dungeon's defenses were becoming solid and that even heroes would struggle to defeat Cruz. However, she questioned whether it was too much to expect everything from Cruz alone. Rick lowered his head, unsure how to respond. He explained that he had never forced Cruz to do anything and that she had always been eager to take on missions. At that moment, Cruz peeked into the room and happily agreed with Yuri's opinion. Surprised, Yuri turned around to face her. Standing proudly with her hands on her hips, Cruz boasted that during the week since her birth, she had already met several intruders. She laughed as she described every battle as child's play and looked forward to facing stronger opponents next time. Yuri quietly accepted her answer while the dark, empty hallway stretched behind them. Even so, she began to think that perhaps she had simply been worrying too much. Elsewhere, a one-eyed cyclops accompanied by several goblins stood before an elf girl and remarked that it was unusual for her to be late. Yuri smiled to herself, believing there was no problem, or at least that there should not be. Meanwhile, at Alan's lodge, a cheerful young man with spiky hair introduced himself as Albert Rado. He enthusiastically expressed that it was an honor to have been personally invited by Alan. Victor watched him from the side in silence, thinking that Albert was supposed to be the prominent ace attacker of Marco's party. Alan stared at Albert, believing he had probably been persuaded by a generous offer or perhaps had not thought the decision through at all. Victor quietly wondered how long the newcomer would last. Albert bluntly mentioned that he had heard the party had not been performing well recently and believed he would be the one to bring fresh energy to the group. The remark offended Alan, who angrily tried to put an end to the conversation. Before anything else could happen, a loud clatter interrupted the moment, and Mary looked on with concern from the side. Alan declared that actions spoke louder than words and reminded everyone that this was the kind of party they belonged to. His party listened in silence, each wearing a worried expression. Alan explained that they would challenge the next dungeon the following morning and that Albert needed to be at his best. Albert casually whistled and playfully remarked that their leader was certainly a hard worker. Victor could only watch him in silence. The scene shifted to the next morning as the sun rose over the mountains. Yuri rushed onto the balcony in a panic, looked over the railing, and called for her master after spotting intruders. Down in the laboratory, Rick stopped what he was doing and looked up. He remarked that there had been many intruders lately and believed Cruz would take care of this group as well. Cruz eagerly accepted the task. Yuri quietly thought that perhaps there was nothing more she could say. However, when she looked into the crystal ball, she noticed the route the intruders were taking. The group of adventurers walked through a long, empty corridor. One of them nervously commented on how frightening it was that nothing had appeared. Another warned that it could be a trap meant to catch them off guard and reminded everyone to stay alert. Someone asked about Jack's progress. Jack confirmed that traps had been placed throughout the dungeon but explained that they would not take long to disarm because they were all easy to understand. After hearing this, another adventurer quietly acknowledged the report and asked Bud for the golden potion. Bud seemed surprised that it would be used there. The adventurer drank deeply from the flask and reasoned that, because there were more traps than monsters in this dungeon and its history was still unknown, they needed to remain cautious at all times. The party continued forward and turned a corner. From above, Cruz looked down at the intruders with a terrifying smile hidden in the shadows. She quietly counted them and noted that there were 5 people in total. One of the adventurers could only stammer in surprise before Cruz suddenly leaped down and launched a fierce attack. A loud clash echoed as he barely blocked the strike with his weapon. Cruz stared directly into his face with wide, excited eyes and bared fangs. She laughed to herself, hoping he would not die too quickly because she wanted to enjoy the fight for a while. Bud then threw a flask through the air while warning everyone to use the flask. Cruz was caught completely off guard and looked confused. The flask burst into a blinding flash of light directly in front of her. Frustrated, Cruz became irritated as stars spun around her head. She slammed her foot hard onto the ground. Watching everything through the crystal ball, Yuri gasped in surprise. Cruz also looked confused as she blinked in puzzlement. Looking down with a serious expression, Cruz suddenly realized something was wrong. Before she could react, a massive pit trap collapsed beneath her. Irritated by the trick, she found the situation extremely annoying. She fell into the darkness below with tremendous force. One of the adventurers stared into the pit in shock and confusion as the ground beneath him began to rumble violently. A swarm of bats suddenly filled the area, surprising everyone. Cruz tried to encourage herself to keep going. However, as she took another step, a sharp snap sounded beneath her foot, and a powerful blast of wind erupted around her. The adventurers watched in stunned silence. One of them could not understand why the girl was willingly running straight into every trap. Meanwhile, Cruz rubbed her eyes as she cried loudly, complaining that she could not see anything. The crystal ball suddenly lit up as Cruz called out to her father. Yuri turned to Rick and reported that Cruz was being pushed back. Rick was stunned, realizing that it was not the adventurers who had forced her back but the traps he had set himself. In the dungeon, Cruz continued crying as she wiped her face. Taking advantage of the situation, one adventurer ordered the others to move forward while they still had the chance. His teammates hesitated, frightened by the idea of fighting such a powerful monster, while the hooded adventurer pointed out that Cruz was too strong for them. Another adventurer, however, instructed the party that simply getting past her would be enough. Hearing this through the crystal ball, Rick broke into a cold sweat. If they slipped past Cruz, they would head directly toward the room where he and Yuri were. Rick stared at the crystal ball in alarm as he called out to Cruz. Her panicked voice echoed back, saying that everything was completely dark. Looking over the dungeon's map, Rick reminded himself that they had recently expanded the dungeon. Although they had filled the new area with random traps and left only a simple pathway, he knew it would not delay the intruders for long. He realized that he had relied too much on Cruz and had neglected to prepare a proper escape route for the dungeon. Someone then tapped Rick on the shoulder. Turning around, he found the Cyclops standing behind him. Together, they looked down the hallway. One of them observed that the trap Cruz had triggered inflicted the blind status ailment and that, from that distance, she would not be able to see the intruders. However, when the adventurers looked behind them, a massive shadowy figure was already towering over them. The Cyclops let out a terrifying roar. The adventurers slowly turned around in complete shock before freezing in place as the Cyclops blocked their path. One of them gasped in recognition, but another refused to back down, believing they could handle it. The Cyclops growled menacingly. Watching through the crystal ball, Yuri panicked and warned Rick that this was reckless because the Cyclops could not handle all of the intruders by itself. In the corridor, the battle began as the Cyclops charged forward and swung its enormous hand at the adventurers. They immediately drew their swords and fought back. The Cyclops roared as the battle continued. One of the armored adventurers admitted that the Cyclops was much tougher than expected, while another calmly reminded the team not to panic because they still had the golden potion. Back in the dungeon master's room, Rick overheard the mention of the golden potion and repeated the name in confusion. At that moment, the hooded adventurer cast a spell that completely froze the Cyclops before following it with a powerful explosive attack. The battered Cyclops let out a weak groan as its smoking body slumped forward. Watching through the crystal ball, Yuri covered her mouth in shock while Rick stared in disbelief. The Cyclops finally collapsed onto the ground with a heavy thud. One of the adventurers remarked that the battle had been difficult and checked whether everyone was alright. Bud assured the group that he was fine, while the hooded adventurer casually remarked that it was only a scratch. Relieved, the adventurer ordered the party to continue moving forward. Cruz stood over the fallen Cyclops as the group of adventurers stared at her in shock. The hooded adventurer remarked that it was too early, but the party realized that her blindness had not worn off yet and believed it was their chance to get past her. Cruz suddenly dashed straight past them at incredible speed. A massive explosion shook the corridor as a section of the wall was destroyed. The adventurers could only watch in horror, frozen in shock. They panicked as a pair of legs suddenly burst through the remains of the shattered wall. Cruz remarked that something smelled unpleasant and did not seem very appetizing. After taking another sniff, she noticed that the scent was very distinct. Marco examined his hands, which were covered in the Cyclops' blood, and suddenly realized what she had detected. Hearing this, Bud shouted Marco's name in panic. With her eyes still closed, Cruz calmly rushed past the adventurers at incredible speed. Before Marco could react, he was knocked backward and collapsed onto the floor in complete defeat. Cruz quietly stood over him. Lying on the ground, Marco weakly cursed. Cruz slowly opened her eyes and looked down at him with a cold stare. After remaining silent for a moment, she quietly addressed him. The Cyclops let out a low growl. Cruz's expression softened as she looked down at the giant monster and remarked that it was as tough as it looked. Leaning closer to its head, she sincerely thanked the Cyclops for saving her life. From a distance, one of the adventurers silently watched the quiet scene unfold. Back in the monitoring room, the elf girl let out a relieved sigh. Her expression brightened as she realized the Cyclops was still alive. Down below, the Cyclops reached out and gently tapped Cruz on the shoulder, acknowledging that it had been wrong. Rick realized that no matter how powerful his allies were, it was ultimately his responsibility to decide how to use their strength. He admitted that instead of relying on his own judgment, he had depended too much on his skills and his powerful companions. Feeling ashamed, he apologized. Yuri hugged him from behind with a supportive smile. She reassured him that there was nothing wrong with relying on the strength of others because, as the dungeon master, that was also one of his own strengths. Rick thanked Yuri. With renewed determination, he resolved to use his abilities not only to protect himself but also to protect all of his companions. An empty corridor echoed with the heavy, exhausted sound of panting. Disoriented and terrified, Albert struggled to comprehend what was happening. His face filled with disbelief as he cursed in desperation, convinced that Alan had completely lost his mind. Charging into a flock of S-rank cockatrices in anger was something not even a newbie would do. Albert froze, his mouth hanging open in shock as the full gravity of the situation struck him. He immediately sprinted through the corridor, frantically looking around for them. Reaching a wide-open space, he desperately searched for Alan, Victor, and Dorma, wondering where the hell they had gone. He came to a stop as shadows completely swarmed around him. A massive, aggressive flock of cockatrices surrounded him from every direction. Cold sweat poured down Albert's face as his eyes widened in horror. Staring directly at the monsters, he could only mutter a hopeless curse. A cry calling Alan Cole echoed through the stone halls. Victor looked up as Rado reported that Alan had seen cockatrices heading in the direction Albert had run off to. Dorma asked the group what they should do and whether they should go look for him. Alan immediately dismissed the idea, insisting it was not worth it and that while Albert was attracting the cockatrices, they should continue onward. Victor stared at him in disbelief, questioning whether he was seriously suggesting that. Before anyone could continue, someone shouted for them to wait. Mary called everyone's attention to Matilda, who was acting strangely. Matilda lay on the ground breathing heavily and drooling. Dorma asked what was wrong with her. The group gathered around as Mary admitted she did not know, explaining that Matilda had suddenly started writhing in pain. Dorma realized the symptoms resembled inhalation of cockatrice venom and concluded that, at this rate, Matilda would be dead within 6 hours. Victor and Alan could only stare in shock at the revelation. Victor asked whether Dorma could make an antidote. Looking down, she explained that an antidote for S-rank toxicity was impossible to produce with only the potions they had, and that even with Mary's healing magic, treating her would be extremely difficult. Mary gritted her teeth, unable to say anything. Alan turned away with a click of his tongue, thinking that even she was useless. The others could not help but think that if Alan had not rushed ahead so recklessly, they would never have ended up in this situation. However, there was no one left in the party who could say that to him directly anymore. Victor thought that if Fitz had been there, he might have been able to stop Alan, and that even Rick would have been a valuable asset to the party at that moment. Covering his face with one hand as sweat formed on his brow, Victor wondered how they had ended up like this. Mary insisted that, for now, they needed to return to town first. Alan immediately shouted back, refusing to be told what to do because he was the leader. Mary cut him off at once, arguing that this was not the time for that when someone's life was at stake. She reminded him of what Dorma had said and stressed that they could not afford to waste any time. Victor and Alan fell silent, both left staring in shock. Alan glared back, believing that Mary had become quite bossy. Mary gasped while Victor called out Alan's name, urging him to hold back for now and quietly pleading with him to stop. Alan turned his head away in silence with a click of his tongue. He walked off, ordering everyone to leave and instructing Victor to carry Matilda. The others watched him leave. Mary quietly thanked Victor, and he reassured her not to worry about it. 2 days and 3 nights later, despite Dorma's potions and Mary's healing spells, Matilda's life slipped away. Although they discovered a remedy during that time, it came too late and Matilda died. Dorma stood nearby as Mary slumped over a table, crying for Matilda. Victor called for Alan, asking where he had been during the past 3 days and bringing up Matilda. He informed Alan that she had not survived. Alan stared blankly in response. Alan lowered his gaze in silence before quietly acknowledging what had happened. He turned his back and walked away. Mary watched him leave while Victor remained nearby. Looking at Victor, Mary admitted that everything had become too much for her and that she could no longer remain with the party. She broke into tears, speaking of Rick's disappearance and what had happened to Fitzan. As she watched Alan's silhouette disappear down an alley, she tearfully questioned whether he even had a heart. Alan walked through a doorway, kicking the ground as he cursed under his breath. He thought bitterly that all their efforts to save Matilda had been completely in vain. During that time, he had been negotiating with many people in search of a replacement, but every response had ended in disappointment. He wondered whether his name had already lost its worth and whether people were now underestimating them. Grinding his teeth as his anger grew, he thought back to Mary's attitude while escaping the dungeon. He remembered the look on her face and recalled how, just like before when she had accused him, she was underestimating him as well despite being nothing more than a healer. Alan kicked a stack of crates into a wall with a loud crack, consumed by the thought that everyone was underestimating him. He spun around in fury, hissing as he shouted about himself. A man standing in the alley observed him and remarked on his attitude. Alan glared at the stranger and his cloaked companion, demanding to know who they were. The man with glasses smiled and introduced himself as Alfred Blythe. He politely stated that he was pleased to make Alan's acquaintance, but Alan immediately cut him off and told him to leave. Still visibly annoyed, Alan made it clear that he was not in the mood. Alfred Blythe replied that it was a shame before producing a letter and explaining that he had come to deliver a message from the king himself. Alan was visibly surprised by the mention of the king. They then returned to the house where Alan's party was staying. Alfred Blythe stated that the king admired Alan the hero for everything he had accomplished so far. However, he explained that Alan's recent repeated failures in dungeon conquests had exceeded the Senate's limit of tolerance, and they were now leaning toward revoking his title as a hero. Alan reacted with furious shock. Alfred Blythe then continued, indicating that there was still more to say. Alfred explained that he believed Alan's past achievements could not be ignored. As a gesture of goodwill, he stated that conquering a few dungeons would be enough to resolve the matter. Alan was surprised by how simple it sounded and questioned whether that was all it would take. Alfred Blythe confirmed that it was and suggested, as an example, the dungeon that had recently become the talk of the town. Upon hearing this, Mary was shocked, immediately realizing which dungeon he was referring to. Meanwhile, Yuri confirmed that Rick was seeking her advice on dungeon management. Rick admitted that, until now, he had mainly been synthesizing powerful monsters to station throughout the dungeon, but he had begun to think there might be more effective ways to manage it. Although his catalog now offered more options, he was still uncertain about what to create next, so he decided it would be best to ask Yuri for guidance first. Yuri simply acknowledged his request. Yuri blushed and became flustered, unable to believe that her master was relying on her. Rick apologized for troubling her if it was an inconvenience. Yuri immediately assured him that it was no trouble at all and enthusiastically promised to do her best to help him. She explained that, before meeting her master, she had traveled to many different places. Rick expressed his hope that everything would work out. Yuri suggested that they first examine the dungeon's current condition. Rick studied the digital map and, after thinking it over, realized that it lacked ingenuity. Yuri explained that while the current layout was suitable if the goal was to have powerful monsters eliminate intruders immediately, it was also necessary to prepare for the possibility that some might survive or break through. She advised creating ways to gradually wear down intruders instead. As a first step, she recommended making the dungeon multi-layered, explaining that doing so would make it easier to organize and command monsters of different ranks while also adding a three-dimensional element to exploration that would make searching much more difficult. Rick immediately understood the concept. Yuri then explained that assigning a specific environment to each floor would provide buffs to the monsters stationed there. She suggested specifying the second floor and executing a floor change. While browsing through the catalog, Rick accepted Yuri's suggestion. The floor suddenly began to transform, and before long, it had completely changed into a forest. Rick watched the transformation in amazement as the floor became a forest. Yuri explained that this was a field change. She further explained that placing monsters better suited to a forest environment would allow them to fight more effectively while making it easier to defend the path leading to the next floor. Rick quickly grasped the advantages of the idea. He then asked whether the DP consumption would be acceptable. Yuri laughed and told him she had good news. She excitedly announced that the DP obtained from the adventurers earlier totaled an impressive 25,000 points. As a result, the dungeon's rank had increased to E. She happily reported that their current DP total had reached 36,200 points. Yuri went on to explain that the total expenditure so far, including the dungeon expansion, floor changes, and field changes, amounted to 14,500 DP. Rick was surprised by the amount. Yuri reassured him not to worry, explaining that from E rank onward, they could build facilities that automatically generated DP. As the two continued their discussion, Cruz stood quietly behind a wall, watching and listening to everything they were saying. Listening alongside Cruz were the Cyclops and the Goblin. The Goblin remarked that her father and mother seemed to be having a very lively discussion. Although she did not fully understand subjects like alchemy or dungeon management, she declared that they would do what they could by focusing on training. Since Cruz appeared to be the strongest among all the monsters, she resolved that they would train even harder. Rick and Yuri overheard them, prompting Yuri to gently remind them not to push themselves too hard. Rick reflected that challenging himself with new things, whether in alchemy or dungeon management, seemed to suit his nature. A memory surfaced of the cloaked man he had met before, who had told him that they shared the same talent and spirit. The man had reached into his clothes and handed Rick an envelope, telling him that if he wished to achieve something great, he should seek out the person indicated within. Rick also recalled the old fortune teller from his hometown village, who had wondered whether the one who had strayed from Alan's path would ultimately achieve something in the end. Rick found himself wondering who that man and that fortune teller truly were. Meanwhile, at the place where Alan's party was staying, Alan dismissed the possibility of having his title or favor revoked, insisting that it was nothing, that it was none of their business, and that he could handle everything himself. Alfred Blythe responded that, although the situation remained favorable, the matter was not merely Alan's personal problem but one that concerned the future of the nation. Alan insisted that the nation's future should be left in his hands. Alfred Blythe observed that Alan did not seem to understand that there was no other way. Alan reacted dismissively. Alfred Blythe then called for Master Albert. Alan was visibly shocked upon hearing Albert's name. Moments later, a cloaked man with a long beard appeared. He remarked that being rigid and honest was commendable, but that flexibility was also one of the virtues of youth. Alan stared at him in shock. The cloaked man then asked about a young man named Rick, explaining that the one he had sent was nowhere to be found and asking where he was. Alan was stunned. Albert remarked that it had been a long time since they had last met and observed that Alan had grown to look quite old. Smiling, Alan thought that Albert had always been like this. He then noted that, on the other hand, Albert still looked like a corpse as always, despite having long since grown old and retired. Meanwhile, Mary wondered who he was. Victor explained that this was her first time meeting him. He revealed that the man was Albert Grace, a mysterious alchemist who had served as a royal advisor since the reign of the current king's grandfather. Although he held the title of royal advisor, he usually traveled through remote regions and seemed to enjoy scouting promising young adventurers as a hobby. Throughout the kingdom's history, Albert had always been present whenever the nation faced critical circumstances. Victor then explained to Mary that one reason Alan had kept Rick in the party for so long despite not getting along with him was because of Albert. Mary assumed it had been due to a shortage of support role members at the time, but Victor clarified that this was only part of the reason. The biggest reason was that it had been the old man's recommendation that led to Rick being added to the party. Judging from the circumstances, Victor believed Albert had been brought in specifically to persuade Alan to accept him. Dorma remarked that this would mean the head of the kingdom's shadow faction had personally become involved. Victor replied that it was only a rumor. Returning to the conversation between Alan and Albert, Albert asked what had happened to Rick, briefly struggling to remember whether his name had been Rick or Hick. Irritated, Alan cursed to himself, thinking that they had been forced to keep the useless Rick around solely to preserve the old man's reputation. Albert stated that he had once held expectations for Rick's potential, but Alan cut him off, explaining that the useless fool had long since been expelled from the party. He insisted that they had looked after Rick for a long time, yet he had never accomplished a single noteworthy thing. Alan questioned whether the potential Albert kept mentioning was actually useful, adding that they did not have the luxury of waiting around to evaluate it. Alan continued by saying that it would be troublesome if they were dragged into Albert's personal indulgences. Albert merely smiled and replied that it was simply a bad habit of an alchemist. He explained that diligent verification and observation were the essence of alchemy and admitted that he often spent too much time pursuing potential. Even so, he emphasized that patience was essential in all things. As he spoke, he looked at Alan as though there were something he wished to impress upon him. The consequences of the party's failures came to mind. Matilda lay dead, while Fitz clutched his body in agony after losing his leg. Looking upon those results, Albert confronted Alan, remarking that he had believed Alan had already learned firsthand where impatience and rash decisions led. Alan gritted his teeth as sweat formed on his brow, glaring at Albert. Looking down at him, Albert acknowledged that he would not deny a reckless attitude, since it was a trait often found among adventurers. However, as someone who bore the title of hero, Alan needed to begin distinguishing between courage and recklessness. In the laboratory within the dungeon, surrounded by glass flasks, Yuri asked her master what he was making this time. Looking at Rick, she added that if it was something that could be prepared from the catalog, she hoped he would let her know. Rick replied that it was not in the catalog, but that while working they had managed to gather the necessary materials. He then presented Yuri with an example. A memory surfaced of an adventuring party standing before a massive door deep inside a dungeon. The dungeon conquest had finally reached its final stage, with only the dungeon master in the deepest chamber left to defeat. However, one member pointed out that their supplies and stamina were running low. Back in the laboratory, Rick looked at Yuri and asked what she would do in such a situation. Yuri looked up thoughtfully, considering the question. The scene returned to the party walking away from the massive dungeon door as Rick explained that, unfortunately, they would have no choice but to retreat. He reasoned that an adventure was only possible if one stayed alive. Looking down with slight disappointment, he reflected that he wished people could always act that rationally. The memory shifted to the dungeon corridor, where an armored adventurer explained that reality was not so simple. If they returned later, the dungeon structure might have changed significantly, making the information gathered during their previous attempt nearly useless. Back in the present, Rick continued, explaining that, more importantly, adventurers were not a united front. The memory showed groups of rival adventurers as a dark-haired man explained that competition and sabotage between parties were everyday occurrences. While one party retreated, another could easily steal the achievement they had worked toward. Rick concluded that, in situations like that, adventurers could only press forward, even if doing so was reckless. Yuri lowered her gaze and argued that it sounded like far too great a gamble. Another memory showed a wounded party member sitting on the ground while an armored warrior leaned heavily on his sword, explaining that even if they won, they might lose their comrades. As adventurers, suffering an injury from which recovery was impossible was an obvious risk. Returning to the present, Yuri sadly agreed with Rick's reasoning. Rick suddenly smiled with confidence and revealed that this was where his latest creation would come in. Holding up a round glass flask in the laboratory, he explained that it was a golden potion. Yuri immediately recognized it, remembering that the adventurers who had invaded the dungeon the other day had also consumed the same potion. A brief image of Marco drinking from a similar flask crossed her mind. Looking at Rick with widened eyes, Yuri wondered what he intended to do with it. Rick answered only with a sly, knowing smile. Still confused, Yuri suspected that it was another experiment. Rick enthusiastically explained that his first step would be to heal the Cyclops. Cruz then appeared. Standing beside the Cyclops, Rick told Cruz that he wanted her to fight the Cyclops seriously just once. Cruz looked down at him skeptically, questioning whether he was serious. She pointed out that she might accidentally kill it in the heat of the moment. The Cyclops peeked out in complete shock. Rick replied that he did not mind. Holding the glass flask, he proposed that, as a handicap, the Cyclops would fight after drinking the golden potion, asking whether Cruz was fine with that. Cruz smirked confidently, saying that she had no objections, though she questioned whether such a small bottle could truly serve as a handicap. She then declared that it was unfortunate for the Cyclops, but since it was an order from her father, there was no choice. Cruz charged forward with an intense expression, determined to end the fight instantly and without causing unnecessary pain. The Cyclops stood frozen in astonishment, sweat pouring down its face. Watching the scene unfold, Yuri anxiously wondered whether everything would really be alright. Rick remained calm, confidently smiling as he held the flask, certain that Yuri only needed to watch the power of the golden potion.